Okay, so for what appears to be probably one of the biggest things that appears in Void Stranger, there's always a lot of things that we haven't really covered yet. And if you haven't played this game, again, this is a major spoilers, but I think I might have figured out finally what the White Void actually details, finally. And it's actually kind of interesting what it actually is. See, but before we get into this, this is also something we have to talk about. There's actually what is known as there's three Void Lords that were actually created through forbidden means, and not to get confused with the traitorous lords, but I would believe that this White Void is actually supposed to be for a, you know, like to the forgotten. Basically, they're trying to get rid of. It's a domain that they use to get rid of certain things that are useless in the eyes of the other Void Lords. Now, what's strange is this kind of makes sense because, and I'll get into it, but first we have to talk about the forbidden means of the three Void Lords. Now, if you're somebody who has played Void Stranger, there is this idea that there were three Void Lords that were created through forbidden means. Not to get confused with the traitorous Void Lords, but there are three Void Lords that were created through forbidden means, meaning like how Odd saw them at the point in time they created them. These would be Mon, Gore, and Lev. And we'll explain them very shortly. Mon is very interesting. Mon was the very first one that was created through forbidden means, and basically it coveted basically every single thing that it came across. It was a hoarder, it was greedy, and it didn't really want to do anything with the stuff. So if you think about it, it also had she had a rebellious nature. It's possible that's the reason why Odd threw her away, because she didn't believe that that's how they should have spent their life, through progress. They were basically, instead of using things, they were hoarding it for whatever purpose. The stuff, especially hoarding the locusts that they would use throughout the void, because those were considered important for whatever reason. The next one, and well, Mon was basically just a rebel anyways, didn't really side with anybody except for power, and, you know, seemed as a general threat at the time. So number two was Gore. Odd decided to create Gore in an attempt to make something that was even better than what she tried. But what ended up happening was Gore was actually, ironically, probably the most harmless of all the Void Lords, but the reason why it was considered useless was because it literally was useless in this case. Gore didn't really want to do anything, was basically a slug, slept, didn't want to amount to anything. It was basically, it was created instead of through motivation, it basically did the opposite. It didn't do anything. It was basically indecisive, always wanted to sleep and be lazy, and it was just indecisive and didn't want to set itself to anything. So basically, in an attempt, they basically, you know, they left Gore alone for so long, but then eventually Gore got decapitated when the war was going on by Lev, or not Lev, by Odd, and then they threw its body in the White Void. Well, the thing is, they probably threw Mon in there too at one point, but Mon was nowhere to be found. Mon was just nowhere. They faked their death, and Mon should have technically have been there. Should have been in like some kind of a purgatory, but the thing was, it was gone. They didn't know what happened to Mon, but Mon was still there though, somewhere. Not in the White Void, but in the main void. And so, and then finally we have Lev, probably the most interesting of all of it, and one of the major reasons why the game happens the way it does. Lev was still my favorite character. I thought Sif was, but, well, Lev is interesting. She was created by Odd, and she would technically be the second last lord that was created by, and instead when Sif was created. Now, the way the story goes, Lev is considered to be very devious as of right now, but she was also very loving at first. This was because Odd made very good sure to not create something that was so devious, but at the same time not so lazy either. She wanted to create something that would think for themselves and to create something that would really love in return. You know, she wanted to create something that was very loyal to her, something that she failed with Mon, and something very useful for Gore. You know, something that, you know, she didn't want to create another Gore or another Mon. So what happened was, she was right about what she did. She created a individual that was able to think for themselves, but at the same time though, they wanted to spend time with her. Well, because Odd is a creator in this case, we can't really say that, we can't really be surprised when we look at Odd's perspective that she wanted to keep creating things. Well, she kind of forgot about Lev, and then what happened was Lev was then later on envious when she created Sif, because now she was no longer, I mean, because the thing is, if you watch the cutscene with Odd creating Sif, you see how all the Void Lords are there. So you see Odd like just struck over the fact that she created Sif, and you see Lev just watching from a distance along with the other Void Lords, that she became envious because she could see at that moment from Lev's perspective, but I don't think Odd really saw it, that her very own creation was going to be the very reason why this whole war would happen the way it did. Sif was then considered to be Odd's favorite because she was finally understanding how to create something that was more human-like, but at the same time though, it wasn't really just a human, but it was more of like, it was capable of thinking, it had its emotions, it was able to think for itself, do stuff that it should have. It wasn't lazy, it demonstrated true leadership, kind of like a god would, a creator. So Sif was able to become a mastermind in some kind of understanding in that. Like, you know, she was basically an organism that was capable of progress. They could do it, they could set their mind to it, boom, they could think. It wasn't a failure like some of them were. And even they were, I mean, I think even Odd was actually kind of shocked at what she did create when if they actually put their minds to it, what they could do. And the same thing could be said about Lev. Later on we'll get into this, but this will be a different video talking about why Lev really did what she did with Sif. And, you know, maybe there's more to the story than just, or there is more to the story rather than that. But what this has to do with the White Void though, is the corpse at the very end is Lev's. The short hair, the fact that she's dead, but she's not completely fade out of existence. See, what's really interesting about Void Stranger, there's actually a few instances where you can clearly see like different, like there will be a time where like Lev is still alive but as a different form. But then at the same time, though, there's that's the original corpse that still has its conscious that still exists. So it's like there's two Levs, one older version and one not. But not like time traveling, but it's just something to do with the way their physical appearances are. It's strange to think because the White Void really does prove that Lev really did have a lot of powers. Like before Sif came into the picture and before she became envious of Sif and Odd, spending more time with her, because really before, if you look at the order of the statues that they're in, Lev was the very last one aside from Sif, and then Dis's final route, which is where the original key was to unlocking the true ruler of the heavens. If it wasn't, in this case, you could even say Odd wasn't really, there would have been something that created Odd that was even higher up. But Odd ends up becoming the main creator because she gets rid of that. If you see what I'm saying. So, but what happened was, because, and it also makes sense because even the forbidden ones, Mon's statue comes before Gore's, then Gore's comes before Lev's, and then finally Lev's comes last. But it's interesting because it actually does make perfect sense that those would be forbidden means, because they were created through, like, they thought they were obsolete. And it's strange to think that, you know, it's also possible that that's probably why Lev did what she did. I mean, because the thing is, Lev absolutely loved Odd. She didn't care about the rest of her sisters, at least not as much. She cared more about Odd. She wanted to be with Odd. And in some way, shape, or form, it's possible that while Odd did love Lev, when she thought she could do better, she created Sif and probably thought that Lev was inferior, or just maybe she didn't love her on the same level, because you got to look at it from two different perspectives. Well, then this drove Lev envious, and she wanted to prove Sif and Odd wrong. But before she could do this, though, we have to go back and look at the White Void. The White Void could have been the one place that they were throwing away the Forbidden Realms, so that way they could be forgotten. Because what's weird is even Sif was trying to prevent people from going back there because of the statue that voids the stairs, and you're not technically supposed to be able to, what they call, warp, whether through the locusts. They weren't, because what's interesting is, like, some of the weird cutscenes you can get, like, here and there, the characters, Sif actually mentions in one of the court cases when they're being prosecuting the main character with they're arguing with Beelzebub. You know, Beelzebub mentions how, or Sif mentions how they shouldn't be leaving those locusts behind, and I think they blame Beelzebub for you know, kind of making it too easy to the chests and all that. Aside from the ones that Mon was supposedly stealing, so they could bring about the resurrection of Lev. But it's interesting because, you know, I think really that's what it had a lot to do with, because what happened was Mon was nowhere to be found. It's possible that that's why Mon probably faked her death. But then at the same time, though, it's they say that Lev was the one that took Mon's life, whether that was intentional or not, probably intentional. But then somehow Mon was able to fake its death, take its seal away. And then then Lev took her life to make it look like, you know, she had a reason. Like, they had this plan, but then at the same time, though, Lev took her own life, but her conscience and her powers still kind of resided there. But at the same time, though, she was reincarnated as a bat that she was. And she always follows. And what's interesting is, this is interesting. The character you play as is Odd. It's reincarnated as. Even Lily, when she's not there, she's also Odd, technically, because she's got Odd's conscience in the scepter. But it's crazy to think, because if that is the case, you still have, like, every time you game over, for example, here's a good way to look at it. You can't do this with Sif, but, you know, it's funny how Sif has the scepter, so you can kind of see, like, her running around as Odd, too, but, like, she's not Odd, though, at least not if she takes over. But what's strange is, if you play as Gray or Lily, when they have Odd's scepter and the other void burdens that belong to, that would be the core memory, the cube, the sword, and the wings, you can actually find out that, I'm trying to think where we state this again, that, you know, Odd is actually being followed by Lev. when you game over. Like there's this little bat that gives you this fruit, and depending on the fruits that you find, you can also get different ones too. But it's interesting to think because Lev was following Odd around to the point where she knew that that was her. And she just didn't recognize her at first, probably because she was lying. But at this point, this is when Lev was too envious to the point where she lost control of everything. And ultimately, what I think is happening here is there's reason to believe that the White Void at one point, it could have been just an additional point. It's possible that maybe it was part of the Void at one point, and it was a different domain before everything got distorted and warped. And at the same time, though, but I think at the same time, though, I do think that that's what they turned the White Void into, was it was supposed to get rid of the forbidden means. They didn't want to kill their sisters, but whatever was left of them. Mon was nowhere to be found, it faked its death. Lev took her own life, and it would definitely explain why Gore's body is there. Again, all three of them should have been in there. Nobody else is in that area, and they don't explain what it's for. It's just like a purgatory that exists that they somehow sealed off, but you can still enter it through like secret means, whether through tactics you're not supposed to, like warping around that you shouldn't technically have. And keep in mind, Odd Scepter only works up until a certain point, or you're not supposed to be able to fully explore the Void but you have the Void. In the way Odd created the Void, it was supposed to only work for her and maybe the Void Lords, because there's certain sections that are sealed off, but they can't change it because they don't have access to being able to move the block puzzles around. So they can't, like one of the rocks says, you have to bend, like when you're solving the brands of the Void Lords, you have to bend the rooms to your will, so that way the game will allow you to go to those secret rooms. You can go to their domains, you can learn their secrets, some of them are empty, but some of them contain items that you actually do need. And why they're there, it's just because things were moved around. So that's how you find the Void Sword. That's how you find the wings, and that's how you find the cube. That's how you can basically learn everything as you're playing through the game. It makes sense. But it's even stranger to think that that's why it's strange to think that the whole White Void is near the very end, and why you find the things that you do at the end. The three characters you were technically supposed to encounter. I mean, Mon's not there, but it's probable that you could probably find it there if it didn't escape somehow. And Gore's body, well, they got rid of Gore because they didn't want Gore anymore, so the body's probably just trying to find a way out, and the fact that it runs into you there is probably, it's not supposed to attack you, but it's really just trying to understand, like it's trying to cry for help, because it's trying to find its head. But it's weird because even if you kill Gore's body is still alive. You can't kill Gore's body though. But it's interesting how, at least I don't think you can. No, I don't think you can. But it is pretty disturbing that I like to think Gore is like a giant plant. You cut its head off, its head dies, its original head, but its body's still alive. And it's plant. It's able to like regrowth itself. It's like a cloning part, like, I don't know if you know this, like if you study biology, you can definitely find plants that are like, once they have like multiple heads, kind of like Hydra, you can cut it off and that plant will still continue to grow. It's what is known as cloning in biology. If you, like a greenhouse, if you grow different plants, you can cut off certain parts of them, and then you can now grow that part instead of just growing it from a seed. You can basically say, I got two plants from the same body, and if you cut it at the right angle, it will still continue to grow, and it will save you time on how fast it will start producing fruits and seeds and whatever the plant is. It's interesting. It really is. But it's like the same thing in this case with Gore's body. Why is Gore's body in the White Void? But how did Gore end up getting decapitated, though? By Odd. That would make sense. So Odd's actions determined it to be like kind of like in a more advanced purgatory. So, and then we have Lev, who was probably just there on her own will, but banished because she was probably at one point probably considered to be inferior, and maybe that's why she started plotting to be envious, because she wasn't considered to be, she was created through forbidden means. So maybe at one point, because what's weird is if you talk to the husk at the very end, it looks like her eyes are closed and her head's been slowly blonked off a little bit. But we find out that Lev was always there, pondering, wondering, and wondering what to do next. And it makes perfect sense that that's Lev, because the way the hair is. But it's even stranger to think that if the White Void really is in fact the Void Lords, the 3 Void Lords that are created through forbidden means, then that would definitely explain why they wanted, some of them wanted their revenge. They weren't just doing it out of revenge. They were trying to prove them wrong, that they were trying to prove their creator wrong. Also, what I find interesting, and this is, again, another video for another time, but there's even reason to believe that even Sif was just as insane as her sisters. And I didn't really think this was true until I really started asking myself this. You know, if you really think about it, before Odd left the Void, why is it that, okay, so if you really think about the zero justice system that they have in the court scenes, there's 3 judges. There's the defendant, the prosecutor, and the judge itself. Technically, before Odd left, she was that creator. But then one of the other characters from Zero Ranger, I do believe, some people believe it's a reincarnated version because the main characters died in that game. But what's interesting is maybe that's not true. Maybe there are higher powers, more than just one. Maybe Odd has a creator. We don't, but we're not going to talk about that yet, because we're only going to talk about what Odd has created and her being a god. So what happens in this case, we find out that when Odd left the Void, everybody thought she was gone. She just ceased to exist. There was no evidence of her gone. Well, no, that wasn't entirely true. She just hid her appearance, and it's like she never left. She was just watching over, not interfering, wanting to see what they do, see if they were really worthy of their creation. Well, this is what happens. So Odd is followed by Lev, B, and Sif. Well, the other 2 judges that are there, aside from the ones that are not the one that took Lev's or Odd's place, you have Beelzebub and Lucifer, which is B and Sif. And what I find interesting is B and Sif, there's actual reasons to believe they were really close to Odd, even looked up to her. Later on, Odd comes back to the Void Lords, and as Gray, and it's possible that maybe some of them don't recognize that that's Odd. But what's really strange to think is that Sif and Odd knew each other very well. Even Beelzebub sort of, I want to say maybe she didn't know that she was actually fighting Odd as Gray. But what's strange to think is they realize that, because it's weird, because there are some Void Lords that do know that Odd is still there, and these would be Lev and Sif. But what I find really interesting is in the Dis route, you end up fighting B and Sif first before you fight Lev. And what's strange to think is if the whole reason Odd gave them those 2 roles because they were supposed to watch over the Void, Odd comes back as Sif, or I'm sorry, Odd comes back as Gray, but she never left the Void, though, if you think about it. Like, I mean, she was there still, and even when she returned, Sif still was fighting her to prevent her from getting into the main core of Dis. And the same thing with Beelzebub. Now, I can understand maybe Beelzebub didn't know that that was Odd, but then at the same time, though, it's possible that Odd, or no, wait, I'll say, so, okay, so Odd, you know, and then Sif was just fighting Odd because she knew that she had defeated her sister, and maybe then she wanted her revenge. But it's strange to think, though, if B and Sif were very loyal to Odd, and Odd was the one that basically gave them the order to protect Dis at all costs, and then Sif and then Odd all of a sudden comes back to that. Why would Sif, outside of maybe killing her sister, why was Sif fighting Odd in the first place? Like, if you think about that, as far as the story goes, because when you fight Sif, and obviously Odd cuts her down, wins. And this is just before you fight Lev. Lev was following you this whole time, and then it leads you to believe that there's more to it than that. So Lev then decides to reveal that she had been watching you this whole time, but then she was able to resurrect herself. But at this point, this is when she loses control of everything and even wanted to cut Odd down because she lost control of everything she was doing. And again, there's a little bit more to the story, but it's something to think about, though. Like, the Void Lords actually were fighting each other because of a war that broke out. But then it's like eventually they started forgetting why they even existed in the first place. And the same thing goes for Lev, Sif, Odd. And it really just, it's interesting to think like how much more to the story that there is rather than just what we see, whether it's the past, the present, the future. And it's just interesting to think that, you know, this game offers so much lore that's just hidden in plain sight that, you know, whether it's a theory, whether it's real, they could make a sequel to it, and it would be interesting if they could. I'm actually surprised that, you know, between Void Stranger and Zero Ranger, just significantly how much different. Like, there's so much stuff in this game that, you know, these two games that you could easily overlook, and most people wouldn't even know some of this stuff exists because nobody's talked about this or archived it, like, as it should be. So it's interesting to think, like, how many questions we can come up with and maybe how many answers we can pull out just based on our surroundings in the area that we're in. And so, again, if anybody wants to hear more, you know, please subscribe. I will be making videos. I also got a Patreon and stuff like that if you want to, you know, donate something, but that's up to you, though. So, but I do make good videos trying to find, I'm trying to find a bunch of good stuff and just talk about it, because maybe we can get a different perspective on what we're not seeing in the games that's out in the open somewhere. So hopefully that kind of explains a little bit more.